Welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Lawrence A. Strick, I'm Peter B. Collins. Today we're pleased to present as our guest Congressman Jared Huffman, the Democrat who represents Marin and all the coastal counties up to the Oregon border. Jared, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome back to the United States. We're speaking here in late January, and you took an unscheduled trip to Germany a few days ago, where you greeted Marin native Jason Rezaian after he was released from more than 500 days of imprisonment in Iran. Now, Jason was a local boy, president of his class at Marin Academy. He reported for the Chronicle and other papers from Iran, and then he was hired by the Washington Post. Now, Iran first detained Jason and his wife, who's also a journalist, then released her. And last fall, Jason was secretly tried and convicted on some sort of espionage charge. Tell us about the work that you did behind the scenes with the president's special envoy, Brett McGurk, to bring Jason home.
Well, thanks for giving me a chance to tell that story. It started 18 months ago when Jason and his wife were detained in Iran. And I think at that time, those closest to Jason, the folks at the Post, his family, assumed that given Iran's history of harassing journalists, this would be a passing thing, that it would end very quickly. So my involvement was quiet at first. I certainly was in touch with the family, but their desire was that we keep this pretty low profile while we try to work it out. What ended up happening is obviously it became much more serious. He ended up in Evin Prison, the notorious Evin Prison. He was put through this Kafka-esque judicial process, and he ended up becoming the longest detained American journalist ever for 540 days. So as we went through that period of time, we became progressively more public, more vocal, and active. And what I did was I continuously brought this up with the administration and made sure they knew this was a priority. You may remember that my vote in favor of the Iran deal came very late. I withheld my position for a very long period of time. That was partly to continue that conversation with the administration. After that, I continued to be involved in meetings with the Swiss ambassador to Iran, who there are protecting power when you don't have diplomatic relations. Other countries step in and kind of provide that bridge. The Swiss do that for us with Iran. So I had several meetings with Ambassador Haas. Also managed to finally have a meeting with the Iranian ambassador to the UN, a guy named Kushru. That was back in November. So that was some of the work that I did. I don't want to pretend that I'm why Jason Rezaian is free today. There was work by a lot of folks. His family was tireless, going all over the world. The Washington Post and journalists all over the world were tireless. There was a petition with the UN Human Rights Commission. So a lot of these things, and then really the administration deserves credit for never giving up. They maintained a push on this, nation to nation, through a diplomatic channel that, you know, for decades didn't exist, but it got opened finally with this nuclear deal, and they used it. And now we have an innocent American coming home.
And it sounds like it was a nail biter down to the last minute. Envoy McGurk told the NewsHour that at the last minute there were snags involving Jason's wife and Jason's mother. What did you learn about that, and how is it affecting you and while you were waiting for this to follow up?
Well, the sense I got from being with Jason and his wife and mom a few nights ago was that it was sort of the final indignity that Iran visited upon these folks, this last chance to mess with them. And that's what happened. What should have been a Saturday morning departure from Iran last Saturday morning ended up dragging into early Sunday morning, our time. And finally, when our diplomats would not back down and when Jason wouldn't leave the country without them, Iran submitted and put them on the plane.
It's really hard to imagine that a nation would want to sort of diss someone at the very end. I mean, that's what from a personality standpoint, it's ridiculous.
Well, we have a complicated relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And sometimes you wonder who your relationship is even with over there, because they have diffused the various points of power. All of it ties back to the supreme leader, of course, but he will activate the radical conservative elements when it suits his purpose. He'll activate the moderates when it suits his purpose. And it complicates attempts to negotiate and to have diplomatic relations.
Jared, you referenced the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear deal. I think it's a major accomplishment for President Obama and Secretary Kerry. And I just want to underscore that it was not a bilateral deal.
Right.
And the Republicans who tried to scuttle it made it seem that way, that we could just bail out and everything would be okay, or maybe we would bomb Iran and somehow that would fix it. But I really think that the president's steady diplomacy here is a model for diffusing other crises. Talk a little bit about, beyond Jason's case, what you were deliberating about over the summer that caused you ultimately to support it.
Well, I think you make a very important point. It's at some point, the vote on the Iran nuclear deal was a choice between multilateralism and working together with other nations and unilateralism, and sort of back to the days of George Bush and cowboy go-it-alone diplomacy, or lack thereof. So I think it was a hugely persuasive point at the end of the day that not only Western Europe and the European Union and the United States, but Russia and China were together around this deal. It was a huge accomplishment by the president, and I think, you know, with vigilance, it can be successful. That's not to say that we won't continue to fight about it for years to come. Every time Iran does something provocative, the president's critics are going to point back to why this deal somehow didn't fix everything with Iran. You're seeing it now with the ballistic missile testing, and the president is a lot tougher on Iran than his critics give him credit for as well. So yes, he just cut a deal that involved a prisoner exchange that brought these Americans home. In the same day, he announced a new round of sanctions over ballistic missile violations. So I think that's how it's going to go with Iran for a while. I think we're going to try to keep building on these diplomatic channels and the modest successes that we've had. But I think we're going to also have to have a firm hand on things like the ballistic missile stuff and their human rights record and some of their aggressive actions in the region.
I think there have been critics in the country and outside of the country. The NSA had reported that there were phone calls by the Israeli government to members of Congress to lobby them that had been recorded. Do you get lobbied by the Israelis on this bill? And if they were recording your calls, is that legal?
I can't really speak to the NSA recording piece of that. I don't have all the facts, and my guess is that, again, the critics of the administration would love to suggest a conspiracy where the president was using his intelligence agencies to go after his political opponents on the Iran deal. I don't know exactly what happened there, but what I will tell you is that yes, Ron Dermer, who was the Israeli ambassador to the United States, reached out and wanted to meet with me and wanted to lobby me. I would not meet with him. I think Ron Dermer is a political hack. He was an arch Republican when he was living in the United States and working with the Republican Party. As ambassador to the United States, he's been highly partisan and, you know, was critical to the very, I think, inappropriate scheduling and rolling out of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to Congress.
And you took a pass on that speech, didn't you?
No, I attended. I
Did you?
attended the speech, but I was also very critical of it.
Mm-hmm. Now, to the NSA part of this, this is not the first time that we have reports that there have been wiretaps of members of Congress. I've interviewed Russell Tice, who was a high-level NSA officer, and he told me point blank that he was aware of wiretaps dating back to the Bush administration that were placed on Senator Feinstein's telephones, on candidates for or members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is deeply troubling that an agency that was chartered to spy only outside the country since 9/11 has turned inward, including people like you. And there's a serious issue, a constitutional issue of separation of powers. Does this alarm you, and is there anything you'd like to do about it?
Well, separation of powers, Fourth Amendment concerns, lots of considerations. It sounds Hoover-esque, you know, that you have this agency, this arm of the executive,
And can you just
Yeah.
explain that for people under 50 who don't know
Oh,
who J.
there
Edgar
are people
Hoover
under
was?
50, aren't there? Yes, so J. Edgar Hoover famously had surveillance files on everyone from
Mhm.
presidents to members of Congress and used them.
We'd
in
sure hate to
questionable
have
ways.
this come out in public,
Yeah.
he would say.
Martin Luther King and
Mhm.
so forth. And I think that offends the sensibilities of most of us today. So I would hope that that's not happening with the NSA. If it is, we need to expose that and make sure there's accountability for it.
Jared, in the year-end budget bill, which was a monster bill, you guys added a Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act to that. And that's intended to deal with hackers, and but critics say it protects corporations by putting personal privacy at risk. What's your position on that bill and the repeal that's being proposed by Representative Justin Amash?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the omnibus, the end of year or beginning of year spending bill, if you will, that got a lot of things attached to it. And what I will say about that, Larry, is there definitely were provisions in that bill that I didn't like at all. That's one of them. I don't think we should have been using a government spending bill to, make major privacy policy. I don't think we should have been using it to lift the 40-year ban on crude oil exports either.
Mhm.
But that got tucked into this
Right.
thing.
Mhm.
Now, to be fair, some really good things got tucked into it too. And at the end of the day, although it was a tough call and I had to swallow some things that I'll work to now reform and amend, there was enough good in it, and it avoided enough chaos by stabilizing our government spending for the next year that I supported it.
So speaking of the internet, you have written a bill it's called the Rural Broadband Infrastructure Investment Act,
Yeah.
to accelerate the build out, particularly to coastal communities, including in Marin and northward into the less populated areas of your district. Talk a little bit about the need for this and how is it paid for?
Yeah, this is a great example of something that the private sector is just not going to do without government leadership, government programs, and government investment. And what we're talking about is areas sometimes not all that far from populated urban and suburban areas that are broadband deserts. West Marin is one of them.
Mhm.
You go out to Stinson Beach and talk to folks about their broadband service, and it's a big problem. You go further up the coast into Sonoma, Mendocino, inland into Humboldt and Trinity. There's huge areas of deficient broadband service, and areas where there's not redundancy. So even where you do have broadband connections, one truck backs over a utility pole and knocks the entire county out in their 911 system. So we've got a long way to go, and my district is kind of ground zero for underserved broadband areas. And even though we have policies on the books through the California PUC that would suggest that the incumbent telecoms have to serve these areas, it's very much against their economic interest to do it. And so we have this not very productive exercise of them claiming that areas are served when they're really not served, and then fighting about it at the PUC. Often local consortia are developed that put forward proposals for funding to try to provide local and regional service, and the telecoms oppose those. So they don't want to serve these areas because the economics stink, but they also don't want competition to spring up that begins to serve these areas and maybe grows into other areas. So it's just an absolute mess. And I think the only way we're going to get past it is with some strong federal leadership and state and local leadership, frankly. There's a lot that local governments can do, and the president seems interested in empowering local government to provide fiber that can be used to bridge these connections too.
That sounds like a great project, and I've been impressed with the work that you've been doing in Congress to help Marin at a local level from Washington. And point blank on that is the SMART train. It sounds that you were able to get funding to extend SMART to Larkspur. How difficult is it to keep local consideration in mind when you're working on these big issues and you're trying to bring home some bacon to the folks here in Marin?
Well, it helps when you've got a local project that, frankly, is pretty interesting to people. The SMART train is rehabilitating this old abandoned rail line in a heavily congested corridor. that's going to do obvious good for our transportation needs, but it's also going to demonstrate, actually the second project in the country to demonstrate what they call positive train control, which is this automated safety override system that prevents operator error from happening. It's state of the art. It's what we're trying to roll out to both passenger and freight rail all over the country. SMART's going to have it on day one. So SMART is really, there's a little bit of sizzle to the SMART project, and I think that's partly why it competed so well for this small starts funding, $20 million in funding that we have secured for it.
Is that the program that keeps getting extended because the rail lines say it's too expensive to roll out?
The freight rail lines have said it's too complicated and expensive, and that if they were forced to do it, that they may have to literally cease operations because there are concerns about whether it'll actually work. Now a compromise was struck on that in the transportation bill a couple of months ago, and I think they have 2 more years to fully implement it. But Amtrak has already implemented it in some of the busiest corridors, and again, you're seeing SMART come online with day one, which will be before the end of this year.
That's what they say.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So it's coming.
Jared, both houses finally stopped the dance of these short-term extensions of the transportation bill. But Republicans absolutely refuse to raise the gasoline tax, which we know hasn't been raised for 20 years, and it's pegged to the gallon instead of the dollar, and therefore we don't have enough money to fix our freeways and bridges. And I'm really glad that the transportation bill was passed, but one of the funding mechanisms is to sell oil from these strategic reserves. Now, we've got an oil glut worldwide, prices at an all-time low. This is as smart as getting a payday loan.
Yeah, buy high, sell low is apparently the strategy.
Yeah.
Whose idea was it? Can we
This
get
is a
name?
Republican idea, so let's be very clear about that.
But is there a spear chucker who we can identify as the idiot who proposed this?
It's more like this. You sort of back into funding solutions like that because Republicans have taken everything else off the table. So, raise the gas tax, put in a vehicle miles traveled fee, do repatriation of overseas revenue from American companies. All of these could have provided, legitimate, honest funding solutions for the transportation bill. All of them were taken off the table by our Republican colleagues. And so you're left with gimmicks. And you're right, there's nothing more gimmicky than selling a strategic asset like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at $30 a barrel oil prices. That's pretty foolish.
It's ridiculous, actually.
Yeah. The only good thing about it is we may be able to turn around and replenish the reserve at $20 a barrel oil prices. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, last summer you were concerned about San Francisco State University and its decision to get rid of the Salmon Institute out of the Romberg Center. You said it was a brazen strategy by San Francisco State University. What's the issue there? Why were you so exercised about it, and what's going to happen?
Yeah, you kind of put the huff in Huffman.
I got a little feisty about that one. I was exercised, and I'll tell you why. So first of all, people may not appreciate that the Romberg Institute out at Tiburon was given to San Francisco State for free by the federal government. In fact, way back in the day, it used to be a submarine net depot for the United States military. So it's given to San Francisco State for free to become a marine science center and an environmental education hub. And at the time it was given, there was already this wonderful existing salmon program. It operated under a group called the Tyee Foundation, but it basically raised juvenile salmon, and there was an education component that became part of that, so kids were involved in the release of these fish, and it served both a conservation and an education role. 40 years in that location, it became a treasured program in that community. Every year these fish release programs would involve kids, wading into the water at Blackie's pasture and other locations and doing this. And what ended up happening is a new director showed up from San Francisco State and said, I don't really want kids around this. It seems like a liability risk. This program doesn't fit where I want to go. You're out of here. And she basically contrived some reasons that were not honest to get rid of them. And then when there was a huge media backlash, in part because I raised heck about it, they entered in negotiations to try to work things out, sending the message to the public that they wanted to find a common ground. When the media backlash died down and it got quiet again, they evicted them. So bad faith, arrogance, imperiousness, I'm characterizing San Francisco State with all of those terms these days.
Is it
it
dead?
over? Yeah.
It is for the Salmon Institute, unfortunately.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's too
So we're working hard to find them a new home. But I think what we really need to do at the same time is find some new leadership at San Francisco State.
Jared, the Republican leadership in your House seems to be completely allergic to any debate about the new wars in Iraq and Syria, and refuses to bring a war powers resolution or even really debate it. Now, the new Speaker, Paul Ryan, has made some baby steps talking about it.
Yeah.
And in the Senate, Senator McConnell has finally offered at least the prospect of a bill. I consider this fundamental, and the President has repeatedly asked for Congress to act. We're now, 18, 19 months into the aerial war campaign over Syria and Iraq with no authority. And I think that's a real serious problem.
Yeah.
What do you see happening to change that?
Well, certainly with dubious authority. The President believes that he can extend his 2003 AUMF authority, because it was broadly written, to cover just about anything. And technically, maybe he could. That's why I have favored repealing that overbroad AUMF and replacing it with something narrow and appropriate, which is really what we need. And to the President's credit, he agrees that that's what we need to do. The Republicans have sort of tried to have all sides of this issue. They want to criticize every move, every strategy of this administration when it comes to foreign policy.
Well, if I may, I see them writing checks for any amount of money needed for these military campaigns,
Yeah.
while they snipe at the President over second-guessing this move or that move.
Well, and their mantra, of course, is executive overreach and overriding Congress, going it alone without Congress, and yet here they are with a square constitutional responsibility when it comes to war making in Congress, and they don't want to exercise it because it's politically too hot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hypocritical, inconsistent, and I think the Republicans are having a hard time navigating this issue.
The President, speaking of the war, seems to have twin goals, that is removing Assad and then somehow defeating this Islamic State. Is that possible? Is that really in the interest of the United States? What does he do, or where do we go with this?
That may be another reason why they're not sure that they want to have an authorization vote, because there are differences within their party, within our party. There are definitely different schools of thought over how we should engage, who's our friend, who's our enemy. It's all mixed in together in this Syrian conflict, and it's incoherent right now. We're sort of on the same side as Iran when it comes to fighting the Islamic State, certainly in Iraq and I think in Syria to some degree, but we are fighting Iran when it arms the Syrian army, and we want to bring down Assad, and of course the Russians are now involved, and it's, as I say, virtually incoherent when it comes to picking out where is our interest, who are our real allies in that region.
So let me ask you about this, because President Obama supported Turkey in the shoot-down of the Russian fighter jet
Right.
that violated Turkish airspace for a reported 17 seconds.
Yes.
Then we had Republicans who were apoplectic because American sailors on two small boats crossed into Iranian territorial waters.
Yeah.
So on that basis, what is the right response? It appears to me that we defused the Iranian situation successfully, and that supporting Turkey's shoot down of the Russian fighter is problematic.
Well, Turkey is a very critical ally for us in this region, obviously, but it's also a high maintenance ally, because Turkey has tortured relationships with the Russians, with almost all of its neighbors. We believe that the Kurds are critical on-the-ground allies in our fight against the Islamic State. Well, Turkey's also a critical ally, because that's the air base that we have to do a lot of this. And Turkey doesn't like the Kurds. In fact, Turkey regards many of the Kurds as terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
Again, sorting out who are our allies, what's in our interest, where is there some coherent policy in this particular conflict in this region right now is just very, very difficult. But the event with the 10 American sailors in Iran was the biggest non-event I think we've had to endure through cable news and Republican media organs over the last couple of weeks.
Ted Cruz still has high blood pressure over there.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, well,
So this is
he has other conditions as well, but
this is an election year, and I think the People's House has a lot of business to do, and expectations are kind of modest by a lot of people. What are your goals for this year, and what do you think we could accomplish that would help folks here in Marin and around the country?
Great question. I'm focusing a lot of my effort on district issues because these are things that I actually can do. If I told you that I'm going to go past single-payer health care or other big ambitious legislative things, I'd probably be raising false hope when it comes to getting them done. Now I'll co-sponsor that stuff and I'll keep trying to move it, but you're right. Major legislation is going to be hard to come by. There are going to be some smaller one-off opportunities. So I think I absolutely can pass a law that brings abandoned Coast Guard housing in West Marin into affordable housing. And we're very close, we think, to making that happen. So that's...
And let me interrupt because we only have 30 seconds left.
That would be great.
Hillary or Bernie? Have you made an endorsement?
I am endorsing Hillary. If Bernie pulls it off and is our nominee, I'll be glad to work in the trenches for him. We've got to win this race. But I think Hillary is going to be the nominee. I think she's not perfect, but I also think she's incredibly smart and qualified and could be a great president. So that's where I'm putting my endorsement.
Congressman Jared Huffman, great to visit with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.